So we're in a series about overcoming giants. And really, we're talking about the giants that are in our lives that we are facing on a day-to-day basis that try and stop us from living out our purposes for God. And the big story from the Bible, that we haven't been looking just at a passage, we've been looking at a big story that takes up a lot of the first part of the Bible. The story of the Jews, the Israelites, being taken from captivity in Egypt. They'd spent a few hundred years in captivity in Egypt. And it's the story of those being taken from Egypt, being taken out of this place of captivity, this place of drudgery, this place of monotony, this place where there was too much work, and being taken to this place of promise, this place that God had promised them that was full of iPads and great work, and well, it's actually full of milk and honey, but I'm trying to put it to today's language, because milk and honey does not sound coffee and Costa coffee and all that sort of thing. This was the place of promise. And while they were in slavery, God had risen up Moses. While they were calling out, God had risen this man called Moses to lead them. And he'd led them out of slavery. He'd led them through the Red Sea. And he'd led them all the way to the edge of the promised land. And as they looked into the promises, they saw these nations that were already there that they would have to overcome if they wanted to enter into the promised land. Now, that should not have surprised them, because God has said many times along this journey, every time they took a step, he told them about the giants that they would have to face. You read it several times about these nations that they would have to face. And one of the verses we've kept reading is from Deuteronomy 7, verse 1. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. So God had told them what they were about to face here. He told them about it, and he'd actually said, I will drive them out. I will drive them out before you. Don't worry about them. Just go in and take it. I will drive them out. But these nations, they all seem like giants. They were larger and stronger. They seem like giants to the people of Israel. And as they got to the edge of the promised land, Moses sent in his 12 spies just to see really what the land was really like. And they spent some time in the land. They got the produce. They got the fruit of the land. And they also saw the giants. And when they came back and gave the reports, the people got scared. The people got scared. The people were intimidated by these people. And as a result, they didn't go into the land. As a result, they spent 40 years wandering about in the desert place. 40 years going from one city to the next, until the next generation rose up, led by Joshua, who would lead them back to the edge of the land. But this time, they would enter into the promises. That's the big story. That's a big story that we've been covering. And we've been looking at each of those giants that they would have to face. Because in our lives, if we do not face the giants that are in our lives, we end up wandering. And many Christians just end up wandering in the wilderness. They're taken out of slavery. They're taken out of this place of bondage, because the Bible makes it clear that unless you know Christ, you are a slave to sin. And it's actually through Christ that we break free from that. And God has broken us free from slavery, but it doesn't mean we're going to enter into our promises. We will not enter into all that God has promised us to do unless we're willing to face these giants that are in our lives. And these giants, they're spiritual forces that often work through situations, work through people. Paul the Apostle makes it very clear that although often it seems like we're facing situations and people, there are actually spiritual forces behind all that we're in battle with. That as Christians, as children of God, we're in battle. And many churches, many individuals miss out because they fail to take on these giants. And each of those giants means something. So we've gone through the Hittites, which were the giants of fear or dread. And many Christians, they never enter in because of fear. It stops them, it binds them. And we display it differently. We don't admit it's fear, and we accuse, we grumble, we do all sorts of things to hide the fact that we're afraid. But it robs us of our promises. We've been through several other of the spiritual giants. Well, today I want to look at two more giants. The Perizzites and the Hittite giants. Now, those names don't mean anything to us now, but they would have meant something to the Jews at that time. They would have understood the meaning behind those names. So let's look at those names first of all. The Perizzite giant. Perizzite, it means an unwalled town or village. Now walls were very important. We don't tend to worry about them too much today, but most major cities historically had walls around them. Even in this country, you go to Chester, we wanted to keep out the Welsh. Sorry, David. But you go to, you go to these major cities and there were walls around them. And biblical times, it was true back then as well. These walls were around the cities. And they were there to protect the city. They actually brought honor to the city because it was shown that this city was important. It was worth protecting. So much so that when Nehemiah, in the book of Nehemiah, and we studied this a few weeks ago, when he saw that the walls around Jerusalem were crumbled, were broken down, were burnt, he was in despair about it. He didn't think, oh well. He was in despair that these walls were broken down because they were that important. They brought safety and security to the people. And it's strange, really, that people would want to live without walls. If walls were so important, why would the Perizzite giants have any sort of influence? Well, it's because walls keep us safe. Walls provide security. But actually, they're also cumbersome. So they also prevent a little bit of freedom. You see, if you've got a walled city, you can't just enter that city and leave it anytime you want, any way you want. You've got to go in through the gates. You've got to go past the gatekeepers. And so it takes away a little bit of freedom. You can't use the land quite the same. If you've not got walls, you can use all the land any time of the year, and initially you can be more fruitful because you're not battling within a confined space. Walls take time, they take effort, they take money to build. So it's understandable that why some people might think, actually, let's not have any walls around this city. An unwalled town. There's actually another root to the word parasite, and that means to separate. If you read Genesis, I think it's chapter 13, where you have Abraham and Lot. Abraham was the uncle of Lot, and Abraham was a very godly man. He was a man of faith. He was somebody who was the ancestor to the nation of Israel. He'd got the protection of God upon his life. Those who lived with him had also got the protection of God on their lives. Lot, his nephew, when he lived with Abraham, had the protection of God on his life. But as they grew up, it was a little bit claustrophobic for Lot, this whole living with Abraham thing. And so at one point they decided to separate. And that's the word we get here that is a similar root to parasite, the word to separate. So Lot separated from Abraham and went to live in this land that looked quite fruitful, quite promising. And he went to live there, and initially he was quite prosperous. But this land was actually infamous, or it later became infamous, because it was Sodom and Gomorrah. And it was that fall of filth that God actually destroyed it, and Lot just about escaped with his life. So as you combine those two meanings, unwalled town and to separate from protection, then you get the meaning of the word parasite, where it comes from. It means to live unconstrained without godly protection. It promises freedom, but leaves you in places that are vulnerable. Now, when you read a lot of the commentaries and the names that they come up with for parasite, a lot because there's no direct words into English, and so they try and explain it. The parasite giant is when you live without godly protection. But I thought that was a bit long-winded, so I summed it up as a giant of stupidity. And I think you'll remember that better anyway. It's a giant of just, because it is stupid. When we live without godly protection, we're living in stupidity. You know, an example of somebody who lived without godly protection is in the New Testament. You've got the story that Jesus told of a son who lived with the protection of his father. He lived in his father, and it sounds like his father was very rich. He'd got lots of servants, got lots of land, and this son lived within that protection. But he found it claustrophobic. He didn't have the freedom that he desired, and so said to his father, "Just give me my inheritance, I'll leave." And he went and he left and he lived his own life. But he soon found out that living without protection only promises a freedom that it can't really deliver. And he ended up becoming a slave to poverty, to these things he'd got himself into. And he ended up having to retreat back to his father. The parasite giant, wanting to live unconstrained. It makes you feel complacent. I don't need that protection. I'm strong enough. I won't fall. But it leads you to a place of vulnerability. You do what seems right in your own eyes. You know, as Christians, we get our protection from different places. God has put godly protection around us. One of the ways is simply by being accountable to other people. It's by being rooted in a local church. Being rooted, not just communicate, being rooted in a local church is one of the God-given ways of providing protection over your life. Being rooted, making yourself accountable to other people, submitting to godly leadership. These are all ways in which you find godly protection on your life. Protection from studying the Word, from spending time with God in prayer. spending time with God in prayer and reading they're not duties that we have to do as Christians in order to be right with God. They're part of the protective wall that God wants to put in our lives. Because without it, we're vulnerable. But so many of us choose so often to succumb to the giant of stupidity and to live outside of that godly protection. Because we feel restricted. And so we want to live without them. I'll come back to that. Let's look at the Hivite giants. This is a little bit harder to trace because the actual name, the transliteration of the name, means a villager or a tent dweller. Now, most commentators, and I won't go into the detail how you get from that to the giant of carnality, but most commentators believe that this represents sensual desire or carnal living according to your immediate physical desires. I suppose you could go to Galatians and the fruit of the nature, such as lust, anger, and those sort of things, living according to how we feel in that moment. Rather than go through the process of how they relate, let's just look at a couple of times that the Hivites are mentioned in the Bible. Genesis 34, verses 1 to 4. Genesis 34, verses 1 to 4. Now, Dinah, the daughter Leah had born to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land. When Shechem, son of Hamor, the Hivite, the ruler of that area, saw her, he took her and raped her. His heart was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. And Shechem said to his father Hamor, "Get me this girl as my wife." And this incident led to a lot of bloodshed. So Shechem, the Hivite, saw this beautiful woman. He desired this beautiful woman, and he took her. He raped her. Talks later how he loved her, but he didn't really show it. He saw, he desired, and he took. He saw something, and then he acted on those desires, the Hivite spirit. In Joshua 9, we see the Hivites again. They were living in the land, and they saw Joshua was getting quite a bit of success. And so they come down to Joshua dressed differently, and they lied. They lied in order to save themselves and ended up in slavery. In Judges 3, they intermarry with the Israelites, and they lead them into sin. See, the Hivites are a people whose name and character means to lead people to be slaves of their fleshly desires, to be carnal, to live according to carnality. Now, you might think I'm talking about the people out there, but I'm not. I'm talking about us. Because every single one of us will have to fight those desires in our own life. You look at even David, one of the most godly men in the Bible. A heart, it describes him as having a heart after God's own. And yet David, one day when he was resting, when he should have been in battle, had decided to take the day off. He saw this beautiful woman called Bathsheba. He desired her, and then he seduced her. And she was the wife of another man. He saw, he desired, and he acted on that desire. It's not just to do with lust, it's to do with any sort of desire that we have when we just act according to our senses. We see, we desire, we act. The carnal nature. The Hivite spirit is one that focuses your attention on fulfilling the immediate desires. You don't see the bigger picture. You don't see the morality of what you're doing. We all know that when you want to do something that you know you shouldn't be doing, you don't think about whether you should be doing it or not, do you? You cut down that part of your brain just for a few moments until you've done it, and then you feel guilty. Living according to the carnal nature without seeing the bigger picture or the consequences, that's the Hivite giants. And both giants try and rob us of our destiny. Try and rob us of the God-given promises over our lives. And you can imagine if the parasite giant is one that causes you to live outside of godly protection, and the Hivite giant is one that focuses your attention on your carnal desires, you can imagine how these two are effective together, can't you? You can imagine why I've decided to talk about them both at the same time. You see them affect the people under Moses' leadership. They affected the parasite giants. You know, those that are affected by a parasite type of giant have problems submitting to authority, have problems submitting to accountability. Moses, there was an accountability structure, but the people constantly rebelled against it. And you see them in Numbers chapter 14, that bit where they lose their promise. In Numbers 14, you see God saying to them, okay, you've refused to go in to fight these giants. I was going to be with you. I was going to look after you, but now I'm going to be with you in the wilderness for a while. At that point, you know what they do? They say, oh, no, I'm not having that. You're not telling me I can't have that. You can't tell me I'm not having the promised land. Yeah, we've done it wrong. Yeah, we're going to go in. We're going to go fight the giants now. And God says, no. No, don't go up there. Moses says, look, if you go up there, you're doing it without God and without his protection. And in Numbers 14, verse 44, it says, nevertheless, in their presumption, they went up to the highest point in the hill country, though neither Moses nor the ark of the Lord's covenant, and we've discussed what that means in a previous sermon, neither Moses nor the ark of the Lord's covenant moved from the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in the hill country came down, attacked them, and beat them. They gave them a good beating because they were outside of God's protection. They were outside of the protection and not wanting to go in. And then when God said, okay, don't go in then, they said, oh no, we're going in. And we'll do it outside of God's protection. They couldn't be told what to do. It's quite ironic. It's quite ironic that they stepped outside of God's protection in order to not fight the giants, and then stepped outside of it again in order to get beaten by the giants. They continually refuse to live under God's protection. You see, the parasite giant will have problems submitting to authority, submitting to accountability, being accountable with others, being vulnerable, exposing your weaknesses to those who can actually help to protect your weaknesses. You know, God wants us in groups of people, other Christians, people who love us, who know our weaknesses, in order to protect us from our weaknesses. It's one of the reasons we are big advocates of going to a small group system, where there's people who know you, not who see you on a Sunday morning, but who know you, who can be honest with you, who you can be honest with them. They've got a tendency to fall regularly. People that are under that spirit of the parasite giant will fall regularly because they put themselves in situations and then they can't understand why they fell. Well, I didn't set out to do that. Why has this all of a sudden happened? Well, most of the time it's because we're stupid. And I use that word, and I know it's a bit offensive, but let's be honest with ourselves. It's because we put ourselves in stupid situations. We do stupid things. We go outside of God's protection, and then we wonder why bad things happen. The parasite spirit of doing what you feel is right and living outside the protection of God, it caused the Israelites to miss out on the promises that he had for them. And the Hivite spirit as well. There was a habit, the Israelites had a habit of very quickly turning to their and focusing on their desires. At one point they were moving forward behind Moses, behind God, and they were moving forward, and the next minute they're just focusing on the here and now and meeting their desires. Whatever kind, you see it numerous times. There's one particular one where Moses is led up the mountain to spend some time with God. He's been given the 10 Commandments. And the people are in the land just waiting for Moses to come down. And he's taken a little bit of a while, so they get bored. Nothing the Hivite giant loves more than a bit of boredom. And so they try and amuse themselves by saying to Aaron, Moses' deputy, well, I'll tell you what, God's up there with Moses. Let's just make our own God out of gold. It's quite comical when you think about it. Let's make our own God out of gold. Have a big feast. In fact, let's read it. Exodus 32, 5-6. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf. That's the idol they built, and announced, tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord. So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterwards they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Moses wasn't around, so straight away they lose their spiritual focus and they shift to physical pleasure. Eating too much, drinking too much, indulging. It just says there, indulges in revelry. We can all imagine the sort of things they got up to. The Hivite spirit focuses us on short-term pleasure. But it also rationalizes it. Let's call it a festival to the Lord. Forget the fact there's a golden calf up there. Let's call it a festival to the Lord. That makes it holy. The Hivite spirit has a very keen way of rationalizing and excusing carnal behavior. Let's call it a festival to the Lord. Short-term pleasure and rationalizing sin. The people had been in God's presence. The moment they left it, they started to feed their earthly desires. They praised God, but mixed it in with doing whatever they felt like. So many of us can fall into that trap of worshiping God, but just living our lives according to feelings, according to desires, and somehow rationalizing it, somehow thinking it's okay. And God says, no, it's not okay. It's robbing you, more than anything else, it's robbing you of the promise God has got for you. It robs us as a church of the promises God has got for us unless we're willing to take on, instead of succumbing to it, to actually overcome it. So how do you overcome these giants? Well, Joshua defeated the giants before he went into battle. Moses was overcome by the giants. I've said this every time and you'll get it. Moses was overcome by the giants before he went into battle. Joshua, in his generation, overcame the giants before they even went into battle. And I believe two of the key ways in which they overcame these giants is found in Joshua chapter 5. Now, I could give you lots of practical ways, and maybe in the future when we talk through these sort of problems and giants and putting themselves in the way of temptations, living unprotected, the carnal way of living. I can talk about lots of practical things. But I just want to pick out two very big, almost obvious points from Joshua chapter 5 that really have to be the starting place, have to be the very thing, the very place that we put ourselves if we're going to see any sort of victory over. Because it's not just about practical, it's not about trying harder. It's not about saying, oh, I won't do that next time. The first thing is a declaration of ownership. A declaration of ownership. Before Joshua goes into battle against the giants, there's a public declaration. He publicly declares who he is owned by. The people publicly declare who they are owned by. And the word we use is consecration. And there's very specific ways in which they made that declaration. That we are owned by God. And we don't like using the word owned because we're very individualistic. And in today's culture, with humanism, feminism, and a lot of the other isms are leading us to a very individualistic way of thinking. And within some of the good that's done through a lot of those things, there's also this individuality that works against biblical principle. The people declare that they were owned by God. Joshua 5, verse 2. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at that place. So Joshua, it goes on to explain that the reason this has been done is because while they were in Egypt, while they were in the wilderness after coming out of Egypt, the newborn baby, they hadn't been circumcised. So they've been wandering about in this wilderness, and for whatever reason, that hadn't happened. And so here in Joshua chapter 5, Joshua declares that all the guys need to be circumcised. And so that's what goes on, and they all did this, and they spend a few days recovering. If you don't know what circumcision is, just ask David. So Joshua chapter 5, verse 9. It says here, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you.'" So the place has been called Gilgal. Gilgal means to roll. The place has been called Gilgal to this day. I've rolled away, I've taken away that shame, I've taken away that guilt, I've taken away the slavery that you were under in Egypt today. As you've declared by this act, it was a symbolic act, you've declared this, that you are mine. The reproach of Egypt has been taken away from you. The circumcision was the way the Jews, it was a public declaration that they were set apart for God. They were not to be used for carnal things, but they were set apart. You know, in this building, we have different colored mops. Well, not just because people like different colored mops. They're because the mop, according to regulations and laws that we have to keep to, the mops that you use in the toilets cannot be the same mops that you use in the kitchen. So we have specially colored mops that are in the kitchen because those mops are set apart for use in the kitchen. You cannot use them in the toilets. They are set apart. They are set apart. We are set apart for use for godly things. We're no better than the toilet mop. But we've been set apart for a different use. You know, the reason I wear a wedding ring is to publicly declare that I belong to Liz. She wears a wedding ring to publicly declare that she belongs to me. We belong to each other. And I know the world doesn't like that word belonging anymore when it comes to this. But I don't care. That's a biblical principle. We belong to each other. And I wear this wedding ring to remind myself, Liz, and anybody else that I belong. It's a public declaration of belonging. And before they went into the land, they declared to themselves, to God, and to anybody else who they belonged to. They were designed for use for godly things. Their minds and their bodies, they weren't going to be used for anything else. It was a public declaration. Now, the New Testament doesn't prescribe physical circumcision, but it talks about in Romans chapter 2 about circumcision of the heart. That the Spirit acting on our heart is the public declaration that we belong to Him, that we are His. And sometimes the problem is we put our freedom above our declaration of ownership. And if we want to stay within godly protection, then the first thing we need to do is acknowledge to God, to ourselves, and to others that we do not belong to ourselves, we belong to God. And that affects how we live our lives. It affects what we do with ourselves. We don't want to be doing anything that dishonors who owns us. You know, there's one American politician who got a lot of stick very recently because he in an interview, he happened to say that he won't have a lunch dinner, a business dinner with a woman. And he said, I won't do it. Not a woman on her own. It may be a business dinner. There may be a good reason for doing it. But he said, I'm not going to do it. Because he recognized that he belongs to his wife, and he didn't want to put himself in any place where there might be any accusation, any temptation, anything like that. Now, he actually got a lot of stick for that. An awful lot of stick. It was surprising. But he was making a public declaration of ownership. In his case, because he belonged to God and because he belonged to his wife. He was willing to give up freedoms. He was free to have these lunches. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was free to do it. It was part of his job. He could have done it. But he decided that actually, I don't mind giving up a bit of freedom if it means that my declaration of ownership is lifted up. What are you going to value more? Your freedom to do what you want, or the fact that you're set apart? It was after they were circumcised that the reproach of Egypt was rolled away. It was after they declared that they belonged to God and the shame of being slaves was removed. As we make that same declaration, the same happens to us. As we declare that we belong to God, the shame, the reproach of our sinful, slavish nature is rolled away. So they made a public declaration, and the second thing is they confessed a confession of freedom. A confession of freedom. See, immediately after they were circumcised, immediately after, the next verse talks about another very significant action, another very significant symbolic act that they did. They celebrate the Passover. And it seems like, how I read it, that it's something that at some point during the wilderness process had sort of been forgotten about. They celebrated the Passover. And it was a celebration of something that happened 40 years earlier. Something that had happened in Egypt. And I can't explain it as much as I'd like to explain it right now because of time. But basically, the Pharaoh had refused to let the people go. 9 plagues had been sent as warnings to the Pharaoh and to the Egyptians to let the people go. They wouldn't. Finally, the most severe plague of all came, and all the firstborn children were put to death by an angel that came over and killed the firstborn children. And it came over all the land. And it passed over, and that's where the word comes from, it passed over the houses of the Israelites because they took the blood of a lamb and painted it on their doorposts. Now that may seem really strange to you, and I haven't got time to go into the why of that. So just accept that that's a picture. Just accept that that's a picture of something that they were celebrating because it led to them being set free. The Passover celebrated what God did to set them free. They were no longer slaves. They were no longer bound. They were there to live as free people. And the Passover was a sign pointing forward to what Jesus would do for us on the cross. You see, Jesus died, so it was so much symbolically connected that Jesus died on the festival of the Passover. That's the time he actually died on the cross. His very crucifixion was affected by the celebration of the Passover. He was the ultimate Passover. If you want to be free from your earthly desires, it's not achieved by just trying harder. It's not achieved by setting some good New Year's resolutions in January. I advocate all of that. But that isn't going to set you free from slavery. It's not achieved in those ways. Yes, we do have to make sure we don't live without godly protection. But we cannot live Holy Spirit-guided lives just by trying harder. It's by coming back to the cross. It's by coming back to the fact that we are free. You know, some of you, and I know because I've lived like this before, some of you have been set free from slavery but are still living as slaves. God wants you to remember that you are free from sin. And you don't have to live that way because he has set you free from sin. And sometimes you just need to get it into your head that you are free from sin. You are not bound by sin. You are set free from sin because Jesus, the Passover lamb, has meant that slavery no longer affects you, no longer binds you. Are you living outside of the protection of God? Are you pushing the boundaries? Are you coming to church on a Sunday, worshiping God, but then living a compromised life during the week? I want to say this. Jesus died to set you free. And we need to declare that we're owned by God. We need to confess that we are free and start living as such. We need to keep confessing our freedom until these giants fall.